Thank you to the Pennsylvania Soybean Board for sponsoring our 2025 Crops Conference and Crops Days events. The Pennsylvania Soybean Board is responsible for the proper allocation of soybean checkoff dollars. This farmer-led board preserves and advances animal agriculture, identifies and promotes sustainable practices that provide ROI to farmers, promote biofuels through partnering opportunities, and drive new initiatives to increase the value and understanding of soy. Check them out online at pasoybean.org. Sponsors like the Pennsylvania Soybean Board allow us to host the annual Crops Conference and Crops Days events across the state. These events recap the 2024 PA crop production season, give insight to the latest agronomic research, products, and technology, and offer attendees pesticide recertification credits. If you would like to learn more about these events or to register, visit extension.psu.edu/crops-2025.
Welcome to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Spellman, and I'm joined here with my lovely co-host and colleague, Justin Brackenrich. I almost said your name wrong. Justin Brackenrich.
That's okay. We've only done this 50 times. It's allowed, right? You'll get
That's
it right.
Maybe I'll get it on the 51st time.
There you go. How are you, Ryan?
I'm doing well. It's actually... I'm not going to start with the weather today. We always start with the weather.
There you go.
I was going to say we're in the winter. It's snowing right now, but I'm excited to start looking towards the growing season, really. We're kind of in the middle of our pesticide season and going around and talking to farmers, and there's a lot of excitement about getting in the ground, some reluctance about getting in the ground, and maybe we can start talking about our management decisions in the beginning of the season. What about you, Justin? How are you doing?
I think that sounds great, right? Like, no more talk about the weather. It's been cold. It's been snowy. Let's think about April. Let's think about better days ahead of us. Last year was kind of a rough year, so we're going to file that one in the rough year department. And we're going to talk today about some things that hopefully will make next year, or this year, I guess now, maybe even a little bit more successful from our fertilizer standpoint, our environmental standpoint, and all around from our economic standpoint, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think we have a lot of things to look forward in this 2025 season. I think because of this cold, harsh winter we've had, we have a nice little reset to start with, which I'm looking forward to. And you're right, it's a good time to really start thinking about our fertility choices, and that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So let's walk through the process, right, Justin? We want to plant corn this year, right? What are some of the things we have to do in the early part of the season?
So for me, right, I mean, I think the things that we should be talking about maybe now, we've probably already purchased our corn, right? We probably already have our seed that's already taken care of. A lot of the things that are happening now are learning about new herbicide technologies or things that are available. We're starting to think about fertilizers and new packages and stuff that come along with that. And so that's going to help us kind of get it in the ground. Kind of moreover, and what we're actually looking to go to today is let's pretend we've got the seed in the ground, right? We've got our fertilizer out. We're talking about this maybe June to July phase. And we're going to look and think about our top dressing, right? Our side dressing, whatever we want to call this. This can be dry, this can be liquid. But what we're really thinking about is how can we do that most accurately? And I think that we've got some really great guests on today to help us kind of work through this process of most accurate ways to do that. What do you think? You ready to get into it, Ryan?
Yeah, I'm ready. I think as Justin's alluding to today, we're here to talk about something very exciting called a pre-sidedress nitrogen test, or pre-sidedress Soil Nitrate Test, PSNT. We talk about it a lot, but might not be something that everyone's aware of, okay? So in general, maybe historically, farmers throw around the idea of, if I want 200 bushels of corn, I want to apply 200 pounds of nitrogen, right? That's kind of the standard 1 pound per bushel. But we're going to break that paradigm today and learn a little bit more about what it means to actually provide the right amount of fertility to your corn at the side dress and what you need to think about when you're planting your corn to set yourself up for success. So we have two guests on here today who have been integral in kind of the development and continual research in developing the PSNT test. And that's Robb Meinen. He's been with us before. He's one of our specialists. He does a lot of work with manure. And we also have another specialist on today, Dr. Charlie White, who is another nitrogen specialist and soil fertility specialist on our team. So I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves and maybe how they fall into this picture with the PSNT. So why don't we start with you, Robb? Why don't you go and introduce yourself?
Hey, thanks, Ryan. Great to be back.
Yeah, that's right. Both of you guys have been here before. So the do's and don'ts of winter manure spreading with Robb, and then Charlie, I think the last one you were on was the nitrogen decision to support tool conversation.
Right. So,
Yep.
yeah, thinking about that winter manure application, getting that behind us now, and we can move forward into thinking ahead to spring. So, yeah, I'm a assistant research professor in the plant science department here at Penn State, and also have an appointment as the director of the Penn State Nutrient Management Education Program. So, very good to be back. Thank you.
And hey everyone, I'm Charlie White. I'm also in the plant science department and serve as the extension specialist for soil fertility and nutrient management on the agronomy team. And yeah, looking forward to today's conversation about the PSNT.
So let's just start there, Charlie. What is PSNT and why is it important?
Well, PSNT, as Ryan alluded to earlier, is the Pre-sidedress Soil Nitrate Test. And one of the most basic things that you need to learn how to do here is not say PSNT test, because then you're actually saying test twice, right? So that's an important basic, right? You can distinguish yourself from a novice versus a pro, whether you say PSNT or PSNT test. So that's where we got to start off with. But essentially what this is it's a soil test that you take at a very specific time of the corn growing season, typically when the corn is about 12 inches tall, which depending on when you've planted and where you are in the state, might be early June to mid-June to late June sometimes. And then you send that soil sample to a lab and have the nitrate content measured. And then you can use that information to help develop your sidedress rate and to be as accurate as possible. And so that's what the test is, and what it's designed to do is to try and account for some of the nitrogen that becomes mineralized and available through soil organic matter, through previous manure additions. It can account for this year's manure addition as well in terms of how much ammonium is captured from that application and becomes available. Accounts for cover crop residues, previous legumes in rotation. Really takes all of that background history that is leading up into what's going to happen and be available in that growing season. It takes all that into account, it snaps it into focus, and gives you a number that you can move forward with in terms of how much to side dress on your corn. And sometimes you might find out you don't need to side dress, and that's very helpful information too. So that's a little bit about what the test is.
Could you maybe just talk about the side dressing process and like what a side dress looks like, what you might apply based on this result?
Yeah, sure. So side dressing corn is a practice that has evolved over time, and it's generally considered a best practice, with the idea that delaying the application of some of your nitrogen till later in the growing season helps to prevent it from getting lost, right? Nitrogen is a form that is prone to so many different loss pathways. And one of the things that could happen potentially between applying it at planting versus applying it a little bit later in the growing season is you could have some leaching losses, you could have some denitrification losses. So keeping a fairly significant portion of the nitrogen required by the crop, keeping that in storage until when the crop actually needs it, in June to late June, going into July, is when the crop actually needs it. Delaying that application helps to prevent it from getting lost. Now, one challenge I have seen is that, that's the intention of side dressing, is that you would take what you would normally apply and split it up and not necessarily apply more. One thing I have seen is that, farmers do really like their nitrogen. And as when we start talking about side dressing, some farmers take that as an opportunity to apply a little bit more, right? And so I can understand that tendency, right? We want to make sure we've got enough. We like a crop that looks vigorous and dark green. But a tool like the PSNT is a way to maybe guard ourselves a little bit against going overboard and yes, make that side dress application if it's necessary, but also use the results of the test to say, oh, maybe it isn't really necessary in certain fields, or maybe some fields you might actually be surprised it's a little more than you thought is needed, and maybe you'd get a yield boost there that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise by meeting the full needs of the crop. There's a lot of different ways to side dress. You can side dress with liquid UAN solution. Often that's done with drop tubes, either on 30-inch centers or 60-inch centers. You can also spin on some granular urea or a blend of urea and ammonium sulfate. Some farmers have taken to using just to get a little bit of sulfur in the program there. It really depends on what equipment you have, what maybe retailers you're working with that might provide that custom service, what they can bring out. The granular applications, you might be able to cover ground a little bit faster because they have a wider spread pattern usually, but liquid applications are very precise, and a lot of liquid sprayers now can vary rates and do custom prescriptions and things like that. So, but that's a little bit about what side dressing, why we side dress, and what it might look like on a farm.
Yeah, so Charlie kind of mentioned a few things. I'm going to shamelessly plug other episodes of the podcast real quick. Charlie may have remembered, but he did one in season 1, episode 24 on nitrogen stabilizers. And so if you have a lot of interest about kind of the nitrogen cycle and the ebbs and flow of nitrogen and why it's so fickle and kind of hard to manage at times, I would encourage you to go back and that kind of difficult nature to monitor and model and keep nitrogen in the right spot, in the right source, in the right form is why this is so important. So maybe go back and check that out if you've got some more questions about nitrogen.
Speaking of nitrogen cycle, during introduction, Ryan made a little faux pas on definition of PSNT. He said the pre-sidedress soil nitrogen test. It's the nitrate test. So keep that in mind as you look into this and consider it for your own farm, because the nitrate portion of the nitrogen cycle is kind of catching a snapshot and incorporates all the precursors in the system of your soil that Charlie talked about, the nitrogen pools from manure, legumes, cover crops that are there, and how they're being converted during that warmer soil season part before the corn really needs to take up a lot of nitrogen. We're capturing a snapshot of the nitrate in the soil there, and it's a great predictor of how much more nitrogen you could add or need, and also how much is already in the soil that is supplying resiliency into your soil nitrogen pool, right, available for the crops.
So before we got started, Rob, you mentioned that the PSNT, don't want to mistakenly say test, but the PSNT was updated recently, right? And you're kind of working through some new things with that. Would you like to elaborate on why we're kind of updating that and what we've done to do that?
Well, I'll tell you what, very good scientists back in the 1990s here at Penn State helped to father the PSNT test, Dick Fox and Doug Beagle and others. And it's a fantastic test. But if you think about where we were in the 90s compared to where we are today, right now we have a lot more emphasis on cover cropping, on double cropping, more soil organic matter building up the carbon that's in our soil. And those pools of carbon also hold nitrogen with them, which give us that pool, which can be in the soil right now, kind of dormant until it can be released by microbial degradation and provide resiliency in the nitrogen cycle. So Charlie was the lead actually in pulling that formula and adjusting it from the 1990s up into the 2020s where we are now.
Yeah, and one of the things that made me really want to revisit it is if you were to go back, say, get an agronomy guide, or maybe there's an old fact sheet of the PSNT that's from the original version, and you look at some of the history factors that they have in there were a number of these history factors that you would sort of add up together and create this multiplier that you multiply by the PSNT result. And their history factors like, was it a previous soybean, or was it a previous alfalfa hay, or none? that have a long-term manure history, yes or no? Was there manure applied this year, yes or no? There were some things about our current production practices that weren't represented in those history factors. Things like, is it tilled or no tilled? A lot of our corn acres now are under no-till management, and that really changes the rate at which nitrate accumulates in the soil. So when you till the soil, you stimulate a lot of microbial activity and you get a really fast early peak of nitrogen mineralization and nitrate buildup. Under no-till systems, it's more of a long, slow process, right? We keep our soil covered, we keep it cool, we don't aerate it with tillage. And so the microbes are a little bit slower to wake up in the spring and get active in a no-till system. So I felt like, hey, that's not represented. We have so much more cover cropping now than we did in the 1990s, and we have cover crop grasses, we have legumes, we have mixes, and all of those differences in cover crop management weren't represented in those history factors. We've got higher crop yields now than we did back in the 90s, and so that wasn't represented. One of the things that was kind of a red flag to me is there was an old rule of thumb where if you were over 21 parts per million, that was enough to grow your corn crop without, that's 21 parts per million of nitrate. That's enough to grow your corn crop without needing to side dress. Well, that might have been back when state average corn yields were, 110, 120 bushels per acre, but we can pull off a lot more now. So is 21 parts per million still enough, to grow our current modern hybrids? We were wondering about that. So those were some of the things that really motivated us to say, hey, we got to take a look at this under our new management practices and see, is the test still working, or do we need to tweak the formula in some way?
Yeah, actually, Charlie, some neighboring states had in the past few years increased. Like where we are at 21, they've increased their parts per million for recommendation. I think based largely on expected corn yields increasing.
Yeah, yep, exactly.
So, Charlie, you quickly kind of mentioned there that you revisited this and started applying some of these newer metrics and tested, are those old recommendations still valid? Can you maybe walk us through, like, when you started to modernize this, did you notice a big difference in the results in nitrate and the nitrogen that you'll need to apply based on some of these practices? Did you have to change the algorithm a lot?
Yeah, so a couple things changed, and I'd say they're kind of minor tweaks, but they're interesting, right? As a scientist, anytime you start to see some numbers shift, you want to look at what's the meaning of that. Why are they shifting? So in the formula, the first thing you do, and this is in the old version and it's still true in the new version, is you take your corn yield goal and you multiply it by a factor. And in the old system, you multiplied it by 1.0, right? So basically take your bushels of expected yield times 1.0, and then you subtract off from that your soil nitrate concentration times another multiplier. And I mentioned how that multiplier involved all these different history factors. So under what we saw under the new calibration is that actually the multiplier on the yield goal changed from 1.0 to 0.71. It actually came down a little bit. And that we wanted to try and figure out what does that mean? Why does that come down? And what we looked at is over time, we looked at some other research that showed changes in the nitrogen use efficiency of corn over time. And in the modern era, we've been able to get corn hybrids that are more nitrogen efficient, right? They can grow the same amount of yield with less nitrogen applied. And that's something that I've heard farmers talk about is, we go around and do meetings and have farm visits. You hear farmers say, I'm not using 1.0 anymore. I'm using 0.8 pounds of N per bushel, or I'm down to 0.7 pounds of N per bushel. And so I think, that other people are experiencing that same thing, right? We're sort of finding we're consistent with other people's experience there. So that's one thing that changed. Another thing that changed that I was kind of happy to see is that all of these different history factors that we used to need, it turns out there's just one history factor now. And so it's a multiplier of, I believe, 5.1 times the soil nitrate concentration. You subtract that off of the yield goal multiplier. And you don't need to worry about, was it after alfalfa hay, or was it after corn or after soybean? That single history factor seems to be fairly robust, provided that it's a field with a long-term manure history. So that's the one criteria. Essentially, if it's not from a field with a long-term manure history, we found that that history factor became 0, which really just means that you shouldn't even go out and bother taking a PSNT test because the result isn't going to be utilized at all to adjust anything. So that was a difference. I think to some extent it sort of simplified and cleaned up the way you would use the result of the test to make a recommendation.
Some of those numbers you throw around seem scary when you're just listening to them, right? But if you go to the Penn State website, search the web for Penn State PSNT, you'll come up with the fact sheet that we have out, and you'll see that the formula is actually pretty simple. Once you do your soil test and have that result and know your corn yield, it's just a real simple process.
Yeah, I love that fact sheet. Rob made a really nice little diagram that helps you through the math, little boxes that you can plug the numbers in, and it's really just some multiplication and subtraction to get your answer. The other thing that we did find that I was new and a little bit curious is there is a little bit of an adjustment factor if your previous cover crop was a mixture. For whatever reason, the data seemed to indicate that you should add another 50 pounds of nitrogen onto whatever the formula recommends if your previous crop was a mixture. And sometimes I hesitate whether to even bring that up because it just adds a little bit of extra confusion to things. But there's enough people using mixes that we should probably disclose that. There were only a few samples in the calibration data set that had cover crop mixtures in them, so that number is a little bit uncertain. And we also don't know exactly why, right? What is it about a mixture? But it might be something about just maybe the way the legumes in the mix break down a little bit faster than the grasses and give you a little bit of an artificially high nitrate level early in the growing season. And maybe, later on, maybe as those grasses break down, they might immobilize a little bit of nitrogen. So there is kind of a fudge factor that the data seemed to indicate we needed to include, and that's to add 50 pounds of nitrogen to your side dress according to the results of the PSNT test, right? Go through that calculation and then add 50 at the end.
So you've mentioned a lot of the things that you've done to update this, make it kind of more applicable to 2025 farming, updating practices. We've talked about the manure history and how it really is a lot of dependent on the validity kind of comes from this manure history. Are there other things that are kind of influential factors of this that can make this test more accurate for the user or the interpreter or whoever is out there looking at it?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Either one of you, jump right in.
You go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, the best place for error is if you sample incorrectly. So you have to get a good soil sample, right? The data out is only as good as what you put into it. So if you're going to do this yourself or hire a crop consultant to take the soil testing for you, make sure that you pay attention in those details, because once you send it to the lab is going to have a very strict protocol on analysis, and all that is going to give you good result, but the result's only as good as what you put in. So you have to pay attention to what you're doing there.
And Rob, do you want to go over some of those recommended practices for pulling a sample?
Yeah, and I think, Rob, I'd like you to go over them to describe them, but I will tell you and everyone else, we will put links in the show notes to the fact sheet that you've developed and also where to get to our lab, the Agricultural Analytical Services Lab, to get to that form and that paperwork if you'd like to turn one in. So we'll make sure those links are available for everyone if you'd like to see this, actually visualize it on your phone or your computer. So go ahead, Rob.
No, that's perfect. I'm glad you're going to post that because it's much easier to kind of process if you can look at the couple photos we have in the fact sheet and look at the step-by-step directions. But basically, what you want to do is get out there when the soil has already been planted and growing the corn crop, and the corn is about a foot tall to 2 feet tall, and take that sample randomly. If you have surface application of manure in the field, you want to find spots that are not in a fertilizer band. You want to try to avoid those atypical spots and randomly go and take 10 to 20 soil cores. Those soil cores need to be 12 inches deep, so deeper than we normally go. Pull those cores out, mix them together in one bucket. So you have 20 cores, and then that creates a composite sample. You grab one of those samples and send it off to the laboratory for analysis. At Penn State, the Ag Analytical Service Lab, the cost for a PSNT soil sample result is only $10. So think about how much nitrogen it takes to pay for that $10. So it's highly recommended in today's economic world that you go for this sample and manage your nitrogen correctly. If you happen to have injected manure, we also have a protocol in our fact sheet that describes what you do on sampling with injected manure. And basically, you're going to take 4 sets of samples that are, each set would be 5 individual samples that are each spaced 6 inches across, perpendicular to the direction of travel. So the total number of cores would be 20, the same amount as you would take randomly, maybe even less work because you're walking less distance. And then you take those, composite them, send them to the lab. But those details are in the fact sheet.
Yeah, I promise it makes more sense if you're listening to this while you look at the picture, right? Rob, will you tell us why? So, I think one of the things we want to clear up is because this is a 12-inch sample and we are doing this, this is not something that we can well, I'm going to pull double and use part of it for my regular soil fertility samples, and I'm going to use another part for this PSNT, right? Like that, they're not interchangeable, or you could split them and use half and half.
You do not want to split them. And the normal soil tests are typical soil tests for N and P and pH, right? Those are based on a 6 to 7 inch soil core depth, whereas this is a 12-inch soil core designed specifically for nitrate, and nitrate is normally tested in your everyday soil test. So this is a special scenario.
And another thing to think about when you're collecting your sample too is once you pull that out of the ground and crumble that sample and expose it to air, you're going to stimulate a lot of microbial activity. And so one thing that can happen is if you let that sample sit around over the weekend or sit out in a warm vehicle or sit out in a warm shop or something like that, you're going to get a lot of mineralization and nitrification happening after the sample has been taken out of the field that you don't want that to contaminate your sample. And so we recommend that once you pull the sample, you either keep it refrigerated until you can get it submitted to the lab, or that you try and dry it as soon as possible. And you can dry a subsample on just a paper plate, spread it out on a paper plate, get a tabletop fan or a box fan or something like that, blow in a little bit of air across it, and it'll dry out within a couple hours. If you've got it in a thin layer on a paper plate. And then once it's dried, it's stable, the nitrate levels aren't going to change much, and you can then bag that up and get it submitted to the lab.
Yeah, if you're crumbling it up and come across a root or a worm, toss those things away because those are not representing the bulk soil.
Sounds good. So I take my 12-inch cores, I mix them together, I make sure I dry it and send it as quickly as possible, and ensure I have a good quality and get rid of any worms. Now, when I submit that sample, I am assuming you said you made the questionnaire a little simpler. Are there questions I'm also going to have to answer? And are there other data points that I need outside of that? Or is that kind of the gist of it now?
Well, I'd have to go look at the submission form. Maybe someone here has it pulled up, but I think all they ask for now is your yield goal. And then maybe they make you check a box that says the field has a manure history. And that checkbox is there just to kind of remind you that the new test is really only designed for fields with a manure history. I don't know. Maybe one of you all can confirm that on the submission form.
Yeah, so
there.
you were right there, right? So we've got an expected yield. Long-term manure history is a yes or a no. And we also do have a question asking about cover crop, right? It's a very simple none, legume, grass, brassica, or mixture is kind of a little piece of extra information they're asking.
Yeah, and then I think they are taking that. If you check the mixture box, I think they will probably add the 50 pounds of N back onto what they say your recommended side dress is.
And I will say while I'm looking at it and I've got it up, this is very similar in kind of appearance to if you're used to looking at our agronomic soil samples, where you've got a spot for like 8 or 9 of these being sent in with one kind of header to it, right? It's not like the old samples where you had to put your name and all of your information and then you had one sheet, right? So there's room for you to send multiples in on one sheet of paper. And we'll also attach that to the show notes too. So if you'd like to get directly to this submission form, it'll be available.
Yeah, I'm so glad they have that multiple submission form, because one of the ways that I've seen this test used with the biggest benefit for a producer is someone who's got a lot of fields and they've done something different on all of them, right? And maybe this is someone who's developed a nutrient management plan, a year and a half ago, and they got it submitted and they got it approved. But then push comes to shove in the fall and in the spring, and you've got to figure out places to go with your manure, right? You end up putting different manure groups different places, and maybe some places you put some digested manure, some other places you put some separated manure, other places you inject, other places you broadcast. And then sometimes what you thought was going to be your burn down cover crop, you harvested that for a forage. And maybe what you thought you were going to kill early as your cover crop grew real tall. And then you're like, wow, now all of my fields, they're all over the map in terms of what has happened and how do I get up to speed on that. And the best thing I think a producer can do is to go out and pull a PSNT test from every field, and that PSNT result will snap into focus everything that happened. And one of the things I love the most is you don't even necessarily need to know what your manure analysis was on that field or know exactly what your manure rate is, because all of those things will end up being baked into what your soil nitrate levels evolve into at the time of sampling.
Sure, I think one of the points of this test, right, it takes a lot of the guesswork out, right? It's instead of accounting for all of these management decisions, we're just taking the measurement and seeing what the contribution of all those things you've done to that field and that field history, and now we need to make our decision moving forward, right? So it sounds like we kind of have taken this full circle where we're looking at answering the history of why the PSNT exists, the history of the PSNT, kind of how we can take that sample, and then how we can apply that in our side dress. So is there anything else that you guys have to add before we close this episode off? Anything we didn't cover here?
Well, there's one more thing that comes to mind, which is how not to use the PSNT test. There, I said it, PSNT test, right?
There
Even
you
the
go.
best of
We
us.
caught
Your
you.
own faux pas.
Yeah.
I
So,
won't edit it out.
no, please keep that. Want to keep it humble here. So, sometimes I get a question from a farmer or a consultant, and they want to know, I put 200 pounds of nitrogen on, 200 pounds of commercial fertilizer, and we've gotten a lot of rain since then. And I would like to take this PSNT and see if that nitrogen is still there or whether I need to come back and replace some losses, right? I'd say that's a very common perception that maybe this tool is suited for that. And it's really not suited for that. What it's really designed for is to kind of track the mineralization of nitrogen from organic matter, track the recovery of ammonium from manure, whether it's incorporated or not. That's also part of it. But it's really not designed to say, hey, if I put a large dose of commercial nitrogen, inorganic nitrogen at planting, can I see if that's still there? And in fact, that's actually will violate some of the assumptions that we place around this test of having a limited amount of commercial nitrogen at planting. In fact, across all of the farm sites that we calibrated this on, the maximum amount of commercial nitrogen applied was 50 pounds per acre at planting. So, whether that's with some UAN solution, some starter fertilizer, a little bit of urea or ammonium sulfate broadcast, anything that's going to be an inorganic form of nitrogen, ammonium or nitrate or urea form, that's going to be a really large signal immediately. And it's not that sort of slow mineralization buildup over time. And so if you put too much of that commercial nitrogen on it, sort of masks the signal of that organic matter mineralizing over time. And by masking that signal, we don't get a good reading from the test. So that would be some, a caution as if you're planning to use this test, maybe limit your at planting commercial nitrogen to 50 pounds per less of nitrogen. So like about 100 pounds of urea, let's say, or less. And that way when you come back to sample in June, you're measuring that organic matter mineralization and not sort of the signal of your commercial fertilizer that's been applied.
So Charlie, that's a great statement, and it leads me to two questions I have. So the first one would be, is there a test or is there something that would do what you described? If I've put that 200 units out and it's been really rainy, this doesn't do it, but something would perhaps?
Yeah, there is a tool that's designed for that, and the tool that's the best fit for that is actually probably a computer model of the nitrogen cycle. And right now, the one that's commercially available is AdaptN. AdaptN was actually first to the market many years ago. In that time since then, Climate Field View had a model for a while that was available in the Midwest. Corteva had a model called the granular model that was around for a few years, but is no longer there. But AdaptN has stood the test of time. And really, what that model tries to do is it takes the real time weather during the growing season and you enter in all of your nitrogen management practices and your residual history. You create a field map through the online platform, and that brings up your soil map. And so they know about the soil texture and the drainage class and things like that. And it looks at the weather, it looks at the rainfall, looks at the temperature each day, and it tries to simulate using a computer model how much nitrogen was lost due to leaching or denitrification or ammonia volatilization. And it creates kind of a nitrogen budget for you. It simulates how your crop is growing and how much nitrogen has been taken up by the crop. And then it tries to make a prediction of everything that's happened since then, including loss pathways early in the growing season. How much should you side dress, at the appropriate time of side dressing? So that is a tool that is out there and available, and could help answer that question.
So the second question I have, kind of in the same vein, is what if a field doesn't have a long history of manure applications? Is there a tool we can use to kind of model this side dress uh, because it's not the PSNT?
Yeah, so in that case, you could default to kind of your typical agronomy guide calculations. Would be one way to back up. You could also use the cover crop and soil organic matter adjustment, the tool that we have. So that's another online tool, and I think we had a previous podcast about that we could link to, and we've got a fact sheet. So that works well for fields that don't have a manure history. You could use that, and that in that case, that tool is designed to be run in advance of the growing season. And so you could pull soil samples in the spring, you could measure your cover crop right when you terminate it, and then you could get a recommendation for how much nitrogen you need for the rest of the growing season. And you could then decide, okay, how do I want to split that up? Do I want to put a third on at planting and 2/3 on at side dressing? Maybe I want to put it all on at planting just to save that trip. If you do that, maybe you might want to use some stabilizers like a nitrification inhibitor or a slow release coating on the fertilizer to help it protect against some losses. So that's another tool that you could use when you don't have a field with a manure history.
So just, I just want to make this statement is just because the PSNT is for fields or are for farms that have manure, that doesn't mean that there are not other resources out there for fields that don't, right? So if you are using more upfront nitrogen than 50 units, or if you don't have this long history of livestock or animal manure, it doesn't mean that you're on your own just trying to shoot in the dark out here in June to figure out how much nitrogen to put down, right? There are things available, there are resources, and so take advantage of all of that's kind of out there that all these really smart people are making for us to use.
Yeah, there's lots of tools in the tool belt for nitrogen management, and every year that goes by, there's more and more that's coming out. So it's exciting. There's a lot of opportunities.
Sweet. Well, I think that is probably a great way to end this, right? We have a lot of resources out there, and we are going to definitely put a lot of those resources in the description for you all. So it's always about implementing them properly and knowing what's out there. So that's kind of the role that you two have here, is helping to develop those tools and communicate them. So thank you guys for being on here today. Rob, Charlie, it was great to have you guys on as always. I'm sure we'll capture you guys again in another episode. So thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you both for having us. Look
Yeah.
forward to next time.
Awesome. And for our listeners, thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast, and we'll see you on the next one.